testing. A bit different way to do it compared to the old traditional way. This is one of my normal soil test reports that's done on an average base, meaning that we'll take a composite amount of samples over a block or a management zone. They all get mixed into one sample, and then this is the result. The principles haven't changed doing Gridfarm soil sampling. We're still looking at cation balancing, getting the ratios right in the soil of the cations, getting the anions like the boron and the phosphates into a good level compared to the cations, and then applying what's needed to achieve the goal. So you'll see the pie graph on the left. It's got only 37% calcium in, for example. The aim is closer to about 68. To achieve that, we need to apply on the right hand side, the little light green box, about a ton of lime and about a ton of dolomite. And that's the approach to all the elements, trying to get that balance right. You'll notice there's information on the top right block, the grey and white. That's nutrient levels for each of the nutrients in the soil test, also the pH, organic matter and all those things. With the grid sampling we're doing now, we're creating a map for each of those lines. Grid sampling is typically done with a ATV, whether it's a two-wheel drive bike like I normally use in orchards, or a four-wheel drive quad or side by side, doesn't matter. Essentially what we do is take soil samples on a GPS grid. So on a device, iPad or so, we upload the GPS grid. We literally follow the patterns, drive to each of the points, and we collect a soil sample for each point. Each of those soil samples get individually marked, and they relate to each GPS point where they were taken, and a full analysis is done on them. My little assistant often comes along, looking at me while we weigh the bags and prepare them for shipment. Looking at the Gridfarm soil test maps report, there's a map of, like I said, each test that's done in the soil test. Each of these maps have got a legend, and we might just go into that first. So every map that's got an ideal range has got a green, bright green block or section which correlates to the ideal range. So you'll see for pH we're aiming between 5.5 and 6.5. Either side of that ideal range is still good, but as you get further away, obviously it gets worse. In scenarios like pH where anything below 4.5 pH calcium chloride is bad, we don't typically divide it up. The next one, cation exchange capacity, is typically a range that doesn't have a good or bad. It just depicts anything from high to low or low to high. And you'll see there's no bright green, and just the color change as we go through. You'll see also for each of the color changes there is a amount of hectares linked to that color, and also the percentage of the map covered by that. On the right hand side or in the middle there's all the other information like the date, where the farm is, client, total hectares, longitude, latitude and so forth. So again, looking at pH map, you can see the variation in the pH in this property. This one is one of 3 properties that we'll discuss in this presentation. This is a dairy property, vast pH ranges from anything from 6.5 all the way down to 4.5. The next property is a macadamia property. Big block is a very old block of macadamias, been treated for a long time, and then the little narrow rectangle is a much younger block of macadamias, and you can obviously see hasn't had the history of lime and everything in it, and it's got a lower pH on average than the high block. There's still areas in there that's interesting where the pH is getting too high, and that's typical of average applications. Why is pH so important to us? pH is the result of getting your cation balance right. So as soon as you got your balance right and everything's ticking along, your pH typically ends up somewhere between 5.5 and 7.5. Within that range, everything works. The uptake of all your nutrients is optimal, soil structure is optimal, even your activity of your fungi, bacteria, the way nitrogen changes over in the soil is all good. And also very important, especially on our east coast, is the fact that aluminium is not soluble at a pH above 5.5 water or then 4.5 calcium chloride. This is one of the maps out of the third property we're doing. It's an old cane paddock that's been changed over into macadamias on the coastal flats. Sandy bit on top, you can see the CEC is quite low, or the cation exchange capacity. And then as it gets a higher clay content down to the east, it's a lower end near the river, the CEC gets higher and the ability of that soil to hold nutrients is higher. Our macadamia farm, mature farm, you can see the variation in the CEC in that property. That's all red soils, but still big variation. Moving over to sulfur. Sulfur is quite interesting. It's a very leachable element, and it will wash out of sandier, lighter soil areas. Very high clay areas typically build up sulfur in the soil. Most of this property has got a very high CEC, but also because of history of the property, you can see there's big variations in the amount of sulfur in that soil. Acid saturation. Now if I can jerk your minds back to the pie graph, we had an aluminium and a hydrogen component in the pie graph. This is basically the percentage of those two elements together. But when we look at the acid saturation percentage, it doesn't always show us the problem areas, and that's why we've included the milliequivalents as well of those two elements. And you can clearly see there's some acid soil buildup or aluminium toxicity possibilities popping up in that circle in the middle. Each of the maps in the main book has got a parts per million map and also a percentage map of each element. Now if you remember, this one was quite sandy on the left and very high clay on the right, and it reflects in the parts per million, but that's not necessarily the ratio of those nutrients in that soil. So if we look at the ratio, the calcium ratio, and this is what we work on in every soil. If you interpret the element into a percentage, you include the characteristics of the soil and thus start to compare apples with apples. So you can see that even on the sandy bits there's still a low calcium percentage, and this one is a very extreme map. So moving over to magnesium, one of the elements that we're looking at. So obviously with such a low calcium we'll have a high magnesium percentage. It does get lower in the lowest CEC bits. Potassium variation, very low potassium traditionally in the cane farms, but you can see there's still big variation in the property with nearly enough potassium on that top left hand corner. Sodium gets really interesting in the coastal flats, and when we look at sodium percentage or salt buildup in the soil, we have to look at in relation with potassium. As soon as sodium in the soil gets more than potassium, we tend to run into trouble with plants that don't perform. So a typical solution for high sodium blocks is to add gypsum to help leach out the sodium, but also to look at the potassium content of the soil and increase the potassium in the soil. On our dairy farm, this is a quite interesting build-up. We've got some high sodium areas, or areas that's got high sodium to potassium ratio, and according to the grower that's typical problem areas. This block on the right hand downside that's sticking out from the farm, that used to be an old cattle farm or beef farm that it's got a tradition of having nothing added to the soil, and you can see that the potassium is real low and sodium building up there. Coming to our trace elements are very variable in the soils. They also contribute equal amount of importance to the growing of plants, and thus equally important to address. We often find trace element scenarios, especially in old worked properties, that there's just nothing left. Like you can see in the manganese, the zinc and the copper on this property has got nothing left in the soil. Moving over to our anions, boron. This is our macadamia farm, and interesting enough, there's hardly any boron in the big trees. They have been sucking everything up they can find, and the smaller trees actually have a bit of boron accumulating there. Boron is also one of those elements that we have to look at it in relation to other elements to understand its availability. So we do a boron availability map. The boron availability map is a ratio between calcium and boron in the soil. The map ranges from extremely low in the red to then toxic or extremely high levels in the greys. You can see again, big blocks got no boron available in the soil. And then as it goes to the smaller block, there's actually areas where boron gets toxic, thus making the variable rate and GPS soil sampling that more important. So if we apply boron on average on that rectangle, we will be oversupplying boron to those two spots, and it will become more toxic. Looking at phosphate, phosphate's got a lot of variability in the soil. We typically get scenarios like you'll see on the top right, where there's nearly too much, and then about 200 meters away from it there's no phosphate in the soil. Quite easy to address by adding some supers. In the macadamia orchards, typical scenario we find with traditional applications of manures, and especially chicken manure, is an oversupply of phosphate. Now, as soon as you put too much phosphate on a block, you start suppressing a lot of other elements, especially zinc, and we're actually causing more problems than doing good by having too much phosphate in our soils. Now, if we go back to our dairy property, the two orange blocks are the two newest additions to the farm. This is quite a good dairy farmer. He's been applying phosphate on an average based over his property. And you can see on average he's nearly getting there, although he is applying too much phosphate to certain areas of the farm that we will be addressing in his corrections. Now, soil health. Soil health is a single number that I compile out of all the maps, giving each map a weighted percentage, and then score them out of 5, bringing all those scores out of 5 back to an average. And it gives us a soil health map. So you'll see this one, especially the little orange block on the right, is quite low on average. And as you move up to the better parts of the property, you start seeing some greens coming through, getting closer to 5. Macadamia property is in a much better state. Much more money has been poured into it over time, a lot of organic matter. And you can see that it's turning green and getting closer to a 3 out of 5 score. Moving on to recommendations. Each of the soil books or map books that you receive through Gridfarm soil mapping has got a recommendation section in. So we do a recommendation for each element that's deficient. In your recommendation, we'll start off with a legend again first. You'll see the color scale's got the rates of, for example, ag lime in this case. Each color, looking at say red, tells you how big a portion of the property we're applying and the percentage of the property. Coming down into the nitty gritty, in the middle column you'll see the minimum rate's 500 all the way up to 4.5 ton. Average on the property is 3.5 tons applied. Total lime requirement makes it real easy to order is 103 tons on this property, and we're applying a total of 28 hectares. Lime applications are often capped, especially in the very, very low pH scenarios and very low calcium scenarios. So looking at this one, all the blacks capped at about 4.5 ton. We can come back next year, retest, and putting lime on in the correct rates on the right spots, not oversupplying lime to properties. Back to our big macadamia property, doesn't need much lime, but there's still spots that need lime, but all the white areas don't need any. And with the variable rate application that we can do, we're not applying lime to areas that don't need lime. Going to boron, remember those two toxic spots up in the rectangle we had, you'll see this, it's white. We're not applying any slow release boron on those areas. Super applications, back to the dairy farm, you'll see the two areas that were quite neglected. It's getting supers applied to it to increase the phosphate level in that soil, all done in a variable rate. Rates range from as low as 30 kilograms a hectare all the way up to 240 kilograms a hectare. Potassium application, again we've capped potassium application in this particular scenario at about 400 kilos a hectare of potassium sulfate, but then you've got zones on the western side of this block that's not getting any potassium at all. So when the application starts, spreader trucks get loaded up. We supply the shape files needed to program the spreader trucks so that they know how much lime or how much product to apply in what location, and then they go out and drive up and down a paddock and actually apply the lime where it's needed. So what next? We start all over. Normally we do about 3 years of testing in a row, doing the maps, evaluating how the soils change, and then make a decision after 3 years whether we do a coarser grid, just some spot checks with maintenance applications, or if we carry on precision mapping the property. Thank you very much.